Kawhi Leonard, a two-time Defensive Player of the Year, a two-time Finals MVP, and a two-time NBA champion. Many consider the Claw as one of the best two-way players of this generation and one of the best lockdown defenders the game has ever seen. Kawhi has also evolved into a legit offensive scorer from just about anywhere on the floor, making him one of the best two-way stars in the NBA. What's good, everybody? This is CP, and today let's take a look at how we can build Kawhi Leonard on NBA 2K21 for you this year. So let's not waste any more time and 走起吧. What's good, everybody? This is CP, and I'm very excited about this Kawhi Leonard build, so let's get into it. So I know that the face doesn't really look like Kawhi right now, but I'll change that later, I promise. And now to start things off, things are pretty standard. First name Kawhi, last name Leonard. I wanted to quickly go into why I chose point guard, and in fact I actually tested this build on shooting guard, small forward, and point guard. And basically I realized that point guard is the most optimal position to choose because of the speed and the extra badge count you get. For the other positions you might get a higher attribute for some areas like strength and rebounding, but the rest is pretty diluted in my opinion, and in all honesty I'd rather choose point guard because I'd rather have more badge counts than attribute points, because I feel like on NBA 2K if you have more badges equipped, I feel like your player is more OP than having a higher attribute rating, so you gotta trust me on that. Anyways, the main purpose of this build is to build an intimidating lockdown two-way player just like Kawhi is in real life, and basically I want to use this player to be a pest defensively and a relentless toxic on-ball defender that offensive players don't want to play against. And I'm not gonna lie, I really want to use this build in Park and Rec to piss some people off. I plan to use this build to piss off as many offensive players as possible, especially those dribble gods and sharpshooters. I want to get them heated and rage quit as much as possible this year. And after I lock them down on the defensive end, I think this build has enough offense to either dunk on their face or splash some 3s and 2s consistently, so that's what I'm gonna go for. Basically, the main criteria of this build is that it has the ability to guard multiple positions and possibly from the 1 to 4. Even though it's labeled as a point guard, but I feel like with the right physical profile and the right defensive badges and attributes turned on, then I can shut down anyone from the 1 to the 4, especially smaller small forwards or even power forwards, because I have the speed and the lateral quickness to pretty much keep up with anybody in the park. Now, moving on to the pie chart, I feel like there's a few that you can choose and they resemble Kawhi pretty well, but to maximize this build's potential and to make it as Kawhi as possible, I feel like you have to go with the red and the green. And basically a few reasons why is because I want to highlight the defensive aspect of Kawhi's game, and at the same time I want this build to be able to shoot at a very consistent rate. I plan to use this build in the park as well, and I think being able to shoot is something that is very important in park, because if you can't shoot then you're very limited offensively. If you look at the ratings and the potential to have Hall of Fame shooting badges, I feel like this red and green pie chart gives you the foundation to be a very reliable mid-range shooter, much like Kawhi is in real life. And besides that, with the right shooting badges equipped, you should be able to hit your 3s at a pretty good rate as well, making you a deadly offensive player from pretty much anywhere on the floor. Moving on, I know that Kawhi is a pretty decent dunker in real life, but surprisingly for this pie chart, if you look at his finishing abilities, particularly for his driving, dunk, layup, and close shot, it is actually very decent for a point guard, I feel like, so I don't think you're lacking in those areas at all. And on top of that, they also give you a very decent rating to start for ball handling, so in a sense, in my opinion, this build doesn't really have any weakness at all and is pretty well rounded, and it gives you a little bit of everything, so let's go with that. Moving ahead, let's take a look at the physical profiles. Now I feel like this part is pretty simple. With this being a Park and Rec build, I think the safest way to go with this is to go with the one with the most speed. That way you can keep your options open and make this a very versatile defensive and offensive player, because with good speed acceleration you can do a lot of things offensively and defensively and put yourself in a lot of positions to be a threat. The reason is because on defense you need speed and lateral quickness to keep up and stay in front of your opponents, and meanwhile on offense, speed is pretty important, especially if you want to blow by your opponents or steal a ball and score in transition, or even just to simply get open for a mid-range shot or a 3-point shot. So in a way, I feel like this build is going to be more OP than Kawhi in real life, because it's going to be a lot faster. And On the other hand, I don't think strength is going to be a huge concern because your official listed position is point guard. So unless if you're playing with 2 other point guards in park, you'll probably be guarding smaller players, and probably the biggest player you'll be guarding is someone in a small forward position, and probably hopefully not a 7'3" center. So I don't think you'll get bullied that much. Now moving on to the attributes, the one thing to keep in mind is we want to make this a two-way beast like Kawhi is in real life. So I think the best way to start for this build is work my way out from defense. So if we go down to defense, in my opinion, as a lockdown defender, the 3 most crucial areas to max out on is perimeter D, lateral quickness, and steal. And as you can see, after maxing these out, I already get 10 defensive badges, which is a pretty good start, but obviously we want more. So I would probably go down to the defensive rebound and max that out, and we're close to 20, and let's go up to blocks and add a little bit, and this gives us 20 badges. But personally, as a player that can guard multiple positions, I don't like getting bullied in the paint so much. So right now the interior defense is a little bit weak, so I will add a little bit to that. And now we get 21 badges, so we're sitting pretty right now. And I think this player has the tools to be a defensive beast. Moving on, let's move up to the shooting, because I think this is the second most important aspect of this build, as we can get Hall of Fame badges with the pie chart we selected. So let's see if we can max that out. So the first thing I would do is to probably max out my mid-range and my 3-point shooting, and add a little bit to 3-throw as well to add up my badge count. So obviously you can add more to the post fade to get even more badges, but I feel like 16 is probably the sweet spot for me because I don't need that many shooting badges to be a very effective shooter. So in that sense, I would probably take a little bit away from the free throw to maintain my 16 badges. At this point, it's your choice. You can add more badges if you want, but for the purpose of this build, I don't want it to be a dead-eye sharpshooter like Klay Thompson or Steph, but my goal is to make it a good enough shooter to be a legit threat to score from deep like Kawhi is in real life. So 16 is probably where I'll stick at. And right now with this setup, I think I should be able to get the few Hall of Fame badges I need, along with a few extra silver or bronze badges to really boost my shooting. And now let's move down to playmaking, and you'll see why this build really shines in this area, especially after I max out the pass accuracy and ball handling. You'll have 10 playmaking badges, which is a huge bonus in my opinion, as 10 making badges gives you the option to potentially have 2 gold badges and 1 silver, or a whole bunch of bronze badges. And at the same time, I feel like 10 might be a little too much even, so depending on how you want to make this build, I might even lower this a bit and give it just 8 or 9 playmaking badges instead. And now finally, let's take a look at the finishing categories. So I would probably go up there and max out the close shot, driving layup, and driving dunk, and see if we can get any badges. And since Kawhi is a pretty good finisher at the rim, I probably want at least 2 badges to give him at least silver contact finisher. But since this setup only gives us 2 badges, I'm going to try to see if I can squeeze out 1 more and get 3. Similarly, I don't want to sacrifice too many badges from my D or my shooting, which to me are still the 2 most important aspects of this build. So as I said before, I'd rather take away from playmaking, as I don't plan to use this build as the primary ball handler, but rather a secondary ball handler who is good enough but doesn't have to make crazy plays like Rondo. So between the 2 categories, I would probably take away from pass accuracy over ball handle, and if we just take away a little bit, then bring this back up there and add it to the finishing, and boom, there we go, we get ourselves the extra finishing badge. And I feel like 3 finishing badges completely adds a different dimension to this build, because right now you can max out your finishing badge and get a gold, or get 2 silvers and 1 bronze, or spread out the bronze. So if you look at the overall layout right now, this is pretty nice because you get 3, 16, 8, and 21. And having those 3 extra finishing badges is a very nice bonus to have, especially since this is one of the perks of this pie chart. Now moving on, the body shape, it doesn't really matter, but I think Kawhi is a pretty defined guy in real life, so I'll go with that. And let's move on to the heights. And now moving on to the height, this part could really make or break your Kawhi build. And to make this Kawhi as realistic as possible, I don't think he can be too short, so I would probably increase the height a bit. I feel like anywhere from 6'5 to 6'7 is pretty solid, but if we take a closer look at the stats, I think 6'6 is probably where my sweet spot will be, because at 6'7 I feel like my speed, acceleration, ball handle, steal, mid-range, and 3 takes too much of a hit. Meanwhile, at 6'5, I don't think my defensive stats is strong enough to guard bigger players in the 6'6 to 6'9 range, which Kawhi does a good job of guarding in real life. So to give this build the best of both worlds, I would probably go for 6'6. As you can see, my ball handle doesn't really take too much of a hit, and my speed is still an 85. Meanwhile, I get a very nice increase in my block, my offensive rebound, and my defensive rebound. And then my interior defense is increased to almost 60. And then my 3 most important defensive stats, perimeter defense, lateral quickness, and steal, are still 84 across the board with 86 steals. So I think that's a very solid look, and that's why I choose to go with 6'6. And now as we move on to the weight, you can see that there's not really much incentive to max out the weight, as I'm only getting a +4 in one stat category in interior defense. But meanwhile, my speed and my acceleration drops to an 83 and an 81. And as I said before, speed is probably one of the most important things for this build, and it gives you more options to be a more versatile player. So let's go the other way and lower the weight and see what we can get here. So if we decrease weight to the max at 180, then we get a -4 in interior defense. But now you notice that the biggest difference is that your speed jumps up to an 87 and my acceleration jumps up to an 85. So not only does this gives me the option to speed boost, but at 6'6 and having this high of a speed rating, I don't think many players in Park have both the speed and the size to keep up with this build. So that's why I'm going with 180 here. Finally, moving on to the wingspan. I think this is probably the trickiest part for this build, because you can literally go several directions here, and depending on which skill set you want to give it a boost, you can go either direction. Personally, I think the safest way to go is to leave it at 82.5, and it doesn't hurt to keep everything that way, because right now the stats look pretty solid this way. But if you want, you can add a little bit to your shooting by dropping it down to 81.6. and you only take a slight hit with your defensive ratings. Now, if you go all the way down, you'll get a very decent boost with your shooting all the way up to an 84 mid-range. But then at the same time, your block will take the biggest hit at -5. Meanwhile, I think the other defensive stats don't take that much of a hit, so this is not a bad look if shooting is very important to you. But on the other hand, if defense is more important than you, then you could probably max out your wingspan. And as you can see, your shooting only takes a -3 for every category. And meanwhile, you get a pretty nice boost for pretty much all your defensive categories, and a nice bonus for close shot and dunking as well. So like I said before, this is not a bad look either. It really depends on what you want to go with. And if you really want to focus on Kawhi's defensive ability, then this is probably the way to go. But for me personally, I think I'll probably go somewhere in the middle, probably around 86.1, because at this point I only take a slight hit in shooting in -2, but gain a +2 in dunking, and also get a very nice gain in 6 defensive categories. So I think a 78 midi and a 75 triple along with Hall of Fame badges, I'm pretty confident that I can hit my shots consistently, so I'm not too worried there. And one more thing to remember is that if you take too much away from your shooting, then you won't get the sharpshooter takeover. So if that's important to you, then don't take too much away from your shooting. But as for me, I plan to go with the lockdown takeover anyway, so that's not a big concern. And now let's move on and let's see what we get. So there you go. You get a perimeter lockdown, shades of Kirk Heinrich, Steph Curry, and John Wall. And to be honest, I think these comparisons are trash, and I wouldn't put too much value into them, because since none of these players are 6'6 and can defend like my guys, so I would ignore that if I were you. At the same time, I actually don't mind being labeled as a perimeter lockdown instead of a two-way sharp or a sharpshooter, because in my park and pro-am, I feel like a lot of people are actually misled by your name and they actually take it at face value. So if they see that you're a perimeter lockdown, then many may not realize that this build can actually shoot and it has Hall of Fame badges. So some might even leave you wide open for very easy threes, and then you could just make them pay consistently. So I don't mind that at all, and which is another trick that I sometimes use for my 2K builds, is that to use the name to deceive my opponents. It works sometimes, so that's another thing to keep in mind. So yeah, that's my Kawhi Leonard build, and I plan to upload more gameplay later this year, so make sure you like and subscribe. For 15 years of good luck, hit that like button now and activate your good fortunes. Do it now.